LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the November 15th edition of LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I picked out 41 of the weekend's best clips for what I hope will be an informative show for you all tonight. As usual, my clips come mostly from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States. I'm not going to start with political comedy as I usually do because the very serious and tragic topic that is the topic of about half of the 41 clips I picked out for you is this attack in Paris that happened at the end of the week, and it was apparently directed by ISIS, and it led all the news, all the Sunday morning news programs concentrated almost exclusively on that story. Though there was a little bit of political news, I'll have, after I cover the Paris attacks with about 21 clips, I'll have some clips on the Republican side of the race and the Democratic side of the 2016 presidential campaign, although most of that is also influenced by what happened in Paris. And then at the end, I'll have a couple topics, one of which is kind of related about liberals and Islam from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, and then a couple clips at the end about the student protests at Yale, which have been very overshadowed by the Paris attacks. So since I'm not going to start with political comedy, I'm going to get right into the serious news, and I'm going to start with a couple of the summary news reports from the corporate media. The first one I'm going to show is, I haven't had a chance to post the clip list. I'll post that later if you're watching it as a recorded show. After I do the first few topics, somewhere after the third or fourth topic, I'll give you some explanation as to why the show tonight was delayed and some of the problems I've been having, but I don't want to go into my personal copyright and hardware problems when this Paris attack is really the main topic that I should spend the clips, the first 20 or so clips on. The first clip is from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, where George Stephanopoulos introduced some of the facts and then turned it over to their reporter David Muir. A couple of the facts that I want you to pay attention to in this report are what were the terrorists in the Paris attacks yelling during the attacks, because you'll hear the entire gamut of what they may have been yelling in this ABC report, and then you'll see sort of some in some subsequent clips I'll play, there will only be parts of what they were yelling reported. But here's the ABC report, George Stephanopoulos, and then to David Muir from this morning about these terrible attacks in Paris here.
Carried out 6 sites targeted across Paris. French investigators say at least 7 attackers worked in 3 teams. And just this morning, a car filled with Kalashnikovs discovered in a Paris suburb. We are also learning more about the victims, including a college student from California, Noemi Gonzalez. President Obama weighed in from Turkey this morning, saying the skies have been darkened. It is an attack on the civilized world. This morning, we're going to hear more from President Obama, Senator Marco Rubio, our team of terror experts, and we begin in Paris with World News Tonight anchor David Muir. Good morning, David.
George, good morning. And as you know, this investigation is now fast moving. It's a global investigation. The FBI has now sent a team here to Paris to help here on the ground. And as you pointed out, that discovery this morning, just a short distance from here, about 6 miles, in fact, outside of Paris, that black car, they believe it could have been a getaway car. They discovered Kalashnikovs inside. On the scene they're investigating, as well as behind me, just down the road here, that concert hall where those attackers inflicted such horror inside. More than 100 held hostage inside that theater this morning. For the first time, the video outside the theater as police here in Paris took on those attackers. This morning, dramatic new video showing the moment French police faced off with the gunman who had just been inflicting horror inside that concert hall. Time magazine obtaining video of this terrifying scene unfolding Friday night. At first, a Paris street in stunned silence, aware of the horror inside that theater. Then outside, a barrage of bullets. An exchange of gunfire sending police out of the line of fire, then retaliating, civilians fleeing the bullets. Now, nearly 48 hours after those terror strikes, Paris is still a city on high alert. Landmarks closed, the iconic Eiffel Tower shut down. The deputy mayor here telling us they have never seen terror like this.
This is not Paris. This is not Paris. This is Baghdad. This is, I don't know, but this is not Paris.
There are new pictures emerging this Sunday of French President Hollande in that stadium when the first explosion could be heard at 9:20. Realizing the city of Paris was under attack. And at 9:40, terrorists entering that popular Bataclan theater. This Instagram video taken from inside the concert, where the American band the Eagles of Death Metal were playing. Suddenly, you can hear the gunshots cutting through the music. The terrorists holding at least 100 hostages. Witnesses reporting the attackers were yelling Allah Akbar. They were also heard saying Syria and Iraq. We now know there were 3 teams of terrorists coordinating the attacks. Authorities say 7 attackers died, detonating identical suicide belts. While over the weekend in Brussels, authorities say a car leading them to make 3 arrests in relation to the Paris attacks. And among the 129 dead, 23-year-old California State University student Nohemi Gonzalez, studying design and spending time abroad, a professor calling her a shining student. While here on the streets of Paris this Sunday, many here cannot get those images out of their minds. And even here in a city that had already been tested last January with the Charlie Hebdo attacks, the deputy mayor telling me they have never seen anything like the terror that unfolded here on Friday night. The fact that 7 attackers all died, all wearing identical suicide belts, he said, is a signal that they're dealing with a new wave, a new front in this war on terror. George?
So that was the ABC report from David Muir, the ABC reporter on This Week with George Stephanopoulos this morning. Notice in his report he talked about the attackers yelling Allahu Akbar, but also yelling about Syria and Iraq. In this next report from Fox News Sunday, their reporter Greg Palcott will talk about what they yelled, only reporting that they yelled Allahu Akbar, nothing about Syria or Iraq. And then also you'll see they concentrate on this passport, which that becomes an issue that I'll talk about in some later clips. But first, here's the clip from Fox News Sunday this morning. Greg Palcott, Allahu Akbar, and a little on the passport at the end here. Sorry, a little problem with, let me try that one more time here in this clip.
Chris, we are standing in front of the Bataclan Music Hall where 89 young concert goers were slaughtered Friday night as the attackers shouted out Allah Akbar, or God is great, as French come to grips with this horrific terror. That ID'd suicide bomber was found here, or his finger was. His body was blown apart by a bomb. The print from that finger showed that he was a French national, a classic homegrown terrorist. At the National Stadium, a few miles from here, where 3 bombers terrorized 65,000 spectators, a Syrian passport has been found. Greek officials now confirm it was used by a migrant who could have been smuggling in terror. And nearby, another car was found full of Kalashnikov automatic rifles used to shoot and kill cafe goers. All told, 7 attackers were killed or are dead in a coordinated operation which officials say was military style and professional. 109 of the 129 victims have been identified. 392 people were injured, 99 seriously. Several, we are told, of those hurt are American. The one identified American killed, Nohemi Gonzalez, was a 23-year-old California college student. She was here on her semester abroad. Throughout Paris today, thousands of soldiers and police are out in force amid continued closures of everything from the Eiffel Tower and the Louvre Museum to parks, even Sunday markets. A city, a country on lockdown. Yes, French President Francois Hollande has said that ISIS is responsible, and he does call this an act of war. He is meeting before an extraordinary session of his parliament tomorrow. The French and the world waits to see what happens next. Back to you, Chris.
So that was the Fox News report from their reporter Greg Palcott, who actually the first LiberalViewer video I ever made was a criticism of a Greg Palcott report from Lebanon. So I've been covering him for almost 10 years. You notice in that report they talked about the attackers yelling Allah Akbar or Allahu Akbar, but not yelling about Syria and Iraq, and that's sort of like the dichotomy between the people who think it's all based on their Islamic beliefs and people who think it's based on our foreign policy. And I want to show a more credible witness than either of the last two. The last two were reporters. There was the David Muir report from ABC where he talked about them yelling Allahu Akbar and also yelling about Syria and Iraq. And then the Fox News reporter, just the Allahu Akbar. This is from NBC's Meet the Press, but it's their reporter Richard Engel talked to an eyewitness to the concert attack, and her story is pretty horrific, and I wanted to show it. I thought it was really newsworthy, and she only talks about them yelling about Syria over in this clip.
Speaking of that concert hall, we have remarkable firsthand account from a survivor of the shooting spree. Her name's Teresa C. She described the unfolding horror to our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel.
We heard gunshots and terrorists stormed into the concert hall and were shooting madly around everywhere, and we all dropped to the floor and tried not to move and not to be hit. So there was gunshots. They said at the very beginning something, they mentioned Syria in French. Stay down or we'll shoot you, don't move, stay down, and they still continued to shoot. That was next to a guy that got shot in the head that fell on me, so I was covered underneath his body. Just stopped moving, I just did not move. That was the main thing. We tried to, like those that were around us, we tried to give them the message, do not move. There was another guy hurt that was complaining a lot, so we tried to whisper to him to not make a sound. And at some stage there was a grenade that was thrown, or two. It was explosion and more shots and more shots and more shots.
What were you thinking this whole time?
I was just thinking, do not move, and I was thinking about my boys. I thought, might this be it, and will I ever see them again, and will I be the next shot? You know, from 1 minute to the next, it's just like every time you hear the shots, you think, okay, is this me? And if I'm hit now, am I going to be able to be quiet, or, you know?
So you could see the police
I could see the police.
in.
I saw, well, they didn't storm, they came very slowly. I just saw their guns at first, and they were moving in very well protected. And they were also like, we kept saying, don't, because people were starting to raise their hands, help us, shouting, get us out of here. And at some stage, they just said, whoever can, if you can walk, crawl, whatever, out now.
And when you came home, your boys were there?
My boys were there, yeah, asleep, safe.
What was the first thing you did when you came home and your boys were there?
Well, I just hugged my boyfriend, and then I went to see them and cleaned myself.
You were covered in...
I was completely covered, yeah.
Completely covered in blood and hiding under bodies. I mean, it doesn't really get much more horrific than that, I guess. And I also showed that clip because she mentioned that the attackers were yelling about Syria, and she's an eyewitness, so more credible, although I don't doubt that they were yelling about all the things. I just thought it was interesting the way it was reported differently, and having just showed that NBC eyewitness report from Richard Engel interviewing that woman, I think her name was Teresa Seed. Now I want to show the more general report, starting with Chuck Todd's introduction to Meet the Press this morning, where he quoted the Pope as saying that we're in World War III just incrementally or moving slowly. I can't remember the exact wording. And then talking about President Obama's reaction and some of the other basic facts of the attack over here.
Good Sunday morning. Here's what we know at this hour about the attacks, which Pope Francis yesterday called a piecemeal World War III. This is the current death toll and the number of wounded in the series of deadly attacks in and around Paris Friday night. France says 3 teams armed with assault rifles and suicide vests carried out this attack. Authorities have identified one of the concert hall attackers as a 29-year-old French citizen of Algerian origin. It's believed French security had been aware of him and his radicalization since 2010. But he was never actively investigated. We also know one of the other attackers entered Europe through Greece and was registered as a refugee in Serbia. Not yet clear if he was a Syrian. Now, a number of arrests have been made in the Belgian capital of Brussels, leading the French to say this is a terror network. President Obama, who is at a meeting of the G20 in Turkey this morning, called the Paris atrocities an attack on the civilized world.
We will redouble our efforts working with other members of the coalition to bring about a peaceful transition in Syria and to eliminate Daesh as a force that can create so much pain and suffering.
Daesh, another name for ISIS or ISIL that you hear from many officials. What is obvious now is that the war with ISIS has entered a new phase. October 31st, what appears to be a bomb takes down a Russian passenger plane in Egypt, killing all 224 people on board. ISIS claims responsibility as revenge for Russia's airstrikes in Syria. Thursday, dozens are killed when 2 suicide bombers struck Beirut in the deadliest attack in that city since the end of Lebanon's civil war. Again, ISIS claimed responsibility for the attack. And then, of course, there was Friday. Attackers wearing suicide vests and carrying out coordinated attacks with assault rifles slaughter scores of people and bringing terror to the heart of Europe. We're covering this story.
So that was the general report from NBC's Meet the Press. Chuck Todd telling you some of the basic facts, and I thought that was an interesting introduction about Pope Francis's claim that we have this incremental World War III going, or piecemeal World War III is actually what he said. Now I want to show a couple quick clips from French officials talking about the attack. First, also on NBC's Meet the Press, Chuck Todd had on the Justice Minister. I think her name is Christine Taubira, something like that. And she's basically the equivalent of the French Attorney General, talking about the attack being an act of war and how there will be a French response, which of course has already happened since these shows aired, which I'll talk about after you watch that clip here.
Before we went on air, I spoke to the French Justice Minister, Christine Taubira. She's the equivalent of the U.S. Attorney General, and revealed that the French authorities know who the bombers were and are working in cooperation with Belgium, Spain, and Germany. I then asked her if France will escalate its war against ISIS in Syria. Here's her answer.
It's an act of war, and it is a war, and it is a war against civilian people. It is a war against our shared values. It is a war against what we are. And what I observe is that these ones who give orders to young people to kill people and to go to death themselves.
Earlier this
So I just want to show that quick clip from that one French official and the idea of it being an act of war, and especially whether France has the ability to claim that it's been attacked and under NATO, Article 5, and ask for the other NATO allies to come to its aid. That'll be discussed in a little bit. Excuse me, but first I want to show one more French official. This is from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. George Stephanopoulos interviewed this French police official. I think, is it the French Legion that he is in charge? I can't remember his exact organizational title, but he talked about both how there may be this 8th terrorist who has not been caught, and also how they don't know for sure whether this Syrian passport belonged to one of the attackers, which is not what they talked about on some of the other shows. But here's the clip from this French police official on ABC this morning here.
In France, no, and we don't know exactly if some of them come from another country.
So we don't know for sure that the passport that you found actually belonged to the attacker who is dead?
We don't know.
The police have said that 7 of the attackers are dead, but ISIS is claiming there were 8 attackers. So did one of the attackers get away?
You don't know really. It's a possibility. Perhaps all the terrorists died in France Friday. Perhaps no.
And sir, what?
So that's what that French police official was saying when he was interviewed by ABC's This Week. Of course, all of these shows are recorded fairly early in the morning. The latest airing show I have is from CNN's State of the Union, because Jake Tapper, usually they do a replay at 9 a.m. Pacific after the 6 a.m. Pacific airing. But because of the big news this week, they had a brand new live broadcast with some updated information. So this may actually be more accurate than what that French official said. This is Jake Tapper first introducing the State of the Union program, saying, he has his little catchphrase, what's the State of the Union? I guess it's on edge because of the terror attack. And then he introduces Christian Amanpour to talk about how this one attacker apparently at least has a passport from Syria but may not be Syrian, and is matched up with his fingerprints, and they have his whole circuitous route through Serbia and Italy. And anyway, I'll talk about that after you watch that over here.
Hello, I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, D.C., where the state of our union is on edge. The breaking news this hour, a French counterterrorism source telling CNN that terrorists who were directly involved in the Paris terrorist attack may still be on the loose. The 129 people were killed and 352 were injured in Friday's coordinated attacks. Rapidly unfolding developments on this investigation this morning as police all over the world are hunting any accomplices who may still be at large. 7 people have now been arrested in Belgium in a raid, although none have yet been charged. Plus reports several AK-47 rifles were found in this abandoned car in a Paris suburb. French authorities also telling CNN that the first suicide bomber to blow himself up at a French soccer stadium was smuggled himself in, embedded with Syrian refugees. My colleagues, Christian Amanpour and Anderson Cooper, are live in Paris. Christian, you broke this story this morning. What more do we know about how this terrorist snuck into the country?
Well, it is very clear from the French authorities, and I've seen diagrams and all sorts of itineraries, that the person who blew himself up at the Stade de France, the first person, did have a Syrian passport. They don't know whether it was a stolen passport or his actual passport. That's what he showed when he came to Greece. In Greece, he was given additional documents that legalized his status as a refugee, because he claimed to be a refugee. So he was given those documents. Then his itinerary shows that he went to Macedonia, to Serbia, to Croatia, and to Italy. That's a new step that we've learned. And then somehow came here. We don't quite know how, but obviously there's been a lot of talk about the whole Belgian connection. So, that's on the border. Maybe he came in from Belgium, for heaven's sake. They're doing a lot of investigation on that regard. And again, to reiterate, the cadaver, as the French call it, the cadaver that was cleared up after blowing himself up, the finger of that cadaver matched the paperwork that the French say is attributed to him. So that's how they know that this was this person. And they say, additionally, they strongly believe, they say there's no doubt that he was part of an organized ring of infiltrators into the refugee migrant people coming over to Greece by boat, and because his fingerprints were not in any known French database. So he was somebody new to the French authorities, totally different from the French national who was one of the killers at the Bataclan concert hall not so far from us. He was known, and he was a French national. This other person was not known. Furthermore, the other 2 suicide bombers at the Stade de France stadium were apparently, we're told, carrying false Turkish passports. So they believe this is a very long planned, very sophisticated infiltration designed to basically match the threat that ISIS made not long ago, that we will infiltrate the refugees, we will send our fighters to your cities with these masses who are fleeing Syria.
Indeed.
So I don't know what you would conclude from that report. They have it's kind of ghoulish, but there's a finger that they found that matches up with the passport that whether it's a fake passport or not, it claims the person's Syrian, and whoever used it then went through this whole refugee route. And as Christiane Amanpour said at the end, ISIS had threatened to infiltrate the refugees, which is kind of a nasty thing to do, because these are mostly people who are in real dire straits, who need help, and they need to be taken in by some of the countries whose military actions have been responsible for the problems that have caused them to be refugees in the first place. But the fact that at least one of these attackers apparently is a refugee, or has had a paper trail created to make them look like a refugee, or whatever that's supposed to mean, even though some of these other attackers were like native-born French teenagers of is it African or Arab descent? I'm not even sure. But I want to show first a clip of the Republican chair of the House Homeland Security Committee, Mike McCall, immediately pouncing on this possible refugee involvement as a reason we should not take any of these refugees, and disputing an Obama administration official on that, and playing up the threat over in this clip.
Now, Chairman McCall, this report that I referenced earlier, I want to quote from it. Gaping security weaknesses overseas, especially in Europe, are putting the U.S. homeland in danger by making it easier for aspiring foreign fighters to migrate to terrorist hotspots and for jihadists to return to the West. Ben Rhodes, the president's one of the president's closest national security advisors, says they're confident of their procedures in dealing with refugees and how they screen these folks in. You and your Democratic partners here, this was not just your report, this was a bipartisan report. You seem to believe there are a lot of holes. Explain.
There are a lot of holes, gaping holes. There are a lot of foreign fighters. This was a foreign fighter event. We have 5,000 foreign fighters in Europe that have traveled to the region and come back. This is what happened in Paris. We've had hundreds of Americans that have traveled, and many of them have come back as well. I think that's a direct threat. When you get to the Syrian refugee issue, we think 2 of these terrorists were actually Syrian refugees. This causes a grave concern on the part of policymakers, because we don't want to be complicit with a program that could bring in potential terrorists into the United States. And quite frankly, I disagree with Ben Rhodes. I've been briefed by the FBI and Homeland Security, and they tell me that this cannot be properly done. We don't have the databases to vet them past.
You said...
Now, I can't recall if that's the last clip I have on this whole refugee controversy as to whether we should be letting in refugees from the Syrian crisis and the Libyan crisis. And there are several places in the Middle East that U.S. and other countries' military expeditions or military actions have created chaos and all these refugees. And I think that we do have responsibility to the refugees, but then there's the question of whether they can be vetted, and that's kind of what they were talking about there. And I think I do have, when I get to the clips of Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes from the Obama administration in a while, I think he'll talk about the vetting. But first I want to show a few clips on the issue of chatter, whether there was terrorist chatter before this attack. First I'm going to show a clip from Fox News Sunday where their intel reporter says that there actually was chatter beforehand. Like, going back, they found social media chatter that possibly should have been picked up. But then I'll show a few clips after that where several people on the right are saying that there wasn't chatter, that they went dark or they have encryption, and it shows how we don't have good enough surveillance and we shouldn't be criticizing our NSA surveillance. That will all be in some subsequent clips. But first, here's that report from Catherine Herridge on Fox News Sunday where she seems to say that there was social media chatter that we should have seen but didn't see. And I think after, well, you can tell me what you think after you watch that clip here.
Chris, this morning analysts are reviewing the ISIS claims of responsibility with a focus on the English language version, which is delivered in American accented English. It's now clear the plot included a rollout of ISIS propaganda that was prepared in advance, including threats directed towards the Russian people, Rome, London, and Washington, D.C. Separately, Fox News has learned that 4 credible ISIS-linked social media accounts began sharing messages 72 hours before the Paris attack, including images of weapons, the Eiffel Tower, as well as blessings for their mission. A military intelligence source says the social media traffic is now seen as evidence the 3 teams had gone operational. Meanwhile, FBI Director James Comey has told field offices across the country to intensify surveillance on ISIS suspects, hoping to prevent follow-on violence in this country. Before the attack, Comey confirmed there are 900 active ISIS investigations spread over all 50 states. There's a growing body of evidence the attack was premeditated and the terrorists vetted by ISIS in Syria. An anti-ISIS group is reporting this morning that 2 fighters were sent in March and 2 more in May for an operation in France. In August, a French national who was arrested returning from Syria mentioned instructions to attack a concert hall. Chris.
Catherine.
So that report from the Fox News Sunday program, and their reporter Catherine Herridge seems to indicate that there was chatter on social media before the attack. If going back, they can find it 72 hours before the attack, and they also have this sort of command and control evidence that it was directed from Syria based on the social media. And if you can get social media chatter, you don't really need this intense surveillance, NSA surveillance, I don't think so much. But next I'm going to show a clip also from Fox News Sunday where Chris Wallace asks Republican Peter King, who I think is also, he's on some subcommittee for terrorism is how he was introduced. And I think he's also on the Homeland Security Committee, but I'm not sure. And you'll see he says that the fact that they evaded French police means that we shouldn't be criticizing NSA surveillance, and groups like the New York Times and the Civil Liberties Union, he says, actually, and that caught my eye as a member of the American Civil Liberties Union, as I'll discuss after you watch that clip over here.
Let me ask you, if I may, sir, about the security of the U.S. homeland. The terrorists in France were able to evade French intelligence. This was a surprise attack, even though in the wake of the attack on the Charlie Hebdo magazine back in January, the French granted their intelligence much more sweeping powers than we have in this country. Question, if they were able to pull this off in France with the government surveillance that's going on there, how safe is the U.S. homeland?
Well, we have to realize we are the main target. Certainly living here in New York, this is definitely the main target, but the U.S. is the main target. Now, we have been able to coordinate CIA, FBI, Homeland Security, NYPD here in New York. And France has a somewhat different problem, that they have a larger number of radicals and terrorists in their country than we would have in ours. Having said that, this shows the absolute need to have top surveillance, to stop criticizing the NSA, for people like the New York Times and the Civil Liberties Union to stop trying to tie the hands of the NYPD. We have to put political correctness aside, Chris. We have to have surveillance in the Muslim communities. That's where the threat is coming from. I don't think today the French police or French intelligence is monitoring the Catholic community or the Jewish community. The threat is coming from the Muslim community. And that's what we have to be doing here in the U.S. Over the 4th of July, for instance, we were faced with attacks that could have been worse than the worst since 9/11 over the 4th of July. Fortunately, the NYPD, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and the FBI were able to carry out arrests here in New York, which stopped the 4th of July massacre, which could have rivaled what happened in Paris. But we can't let our guard down, and we can't listen to people who say we have to shut down the NSA or tie the hands of the FBI, tie the hands of the police. This is not profiling. This is common sense policing we have to do.
So I obviously disagree with almost everything Peter King said there about how this means we need more NSA surveillance, because you don't need NSA surveillance to find clues on social media 72 hours before an attack. That's something that is anyone can see if you happen to have the intelligence, which apparently we don't, to see that. And I just want to show that it wasn't just on Fox News Sunday that they were promoting this idea that there was some kind of blackout in communication that caused this attack to be able to happen. First, the next clip I want to show is from CNN State of the Union, where Jake Tapper was talking to their reporter Jim Sciutto, and he also talked about the possibility that there was encryption technology, but also admits that it may just be that they were overwhelmed with the number of people that they have to watch over in this clip.
I'm Jake Tapper. We have even more breaking news coming in on the Paris terror investigation about how these terrorists may have been able to keep this very coordinated and apparently very elaborate bloodbath a secret. Let's go to CNN's Jim Sciutto in Paris. Jim, what are you finding out?
Jake, I'm learning from multiple U.S. officials that there is concern that the Paris attackers went dark, as they have said many times. That is, used encrypted communications to avoid surveillance. We've been hearing warnings from U.S. officials, both in private and in public, for months now about this very possibility. They're concerned that there are very easily available means of communication, apps on your iPhone that are invisible, in effect, to U.S. and Western intelligence services, to monitoring by U.S. intelligence services. And there is concern that these attackers use such encrypted communications to avoid surveillance. This goes to a larger issue here, Jake, which is that how did they manage to have such a complex attack in a major Western city without being caught, in effect, particularly considering the terror alert level here, again, particularly following the attack at Charlie Hebdo in January, and this is an area of great concern. I'm told by one U.S. official that it is both encryption and volume, in his words. What is he talking about when he says volume? That is both the volume of refugees coming across the border. There's been concern that ISIS would attempt to hide attackers in that influx, and there's evidence that that happened based on the passport of one of those involved in these attacks. But it is also purely the volume of suspected jihadis here in France and across Europe. We're talking about them numbering in the thousands, and that by itself is simply a challenge for law enforcement to keep track of. But the encrypted communications, something that they really, Jake, at this point don't have a solution for.
Yeah, we keep hearing about European intelligence and national security agencies being completely outmanned by the overwhelming number of Islamist jihadis coming back from a war zone in Syria and Iraq. Jim?
So, yeah, you can see in that report that they talk both about how the number of people they have to surveil is overwhelming, but also this idea that they're engaging in encrypted communications, which seems sort of contradictory to that first clip in this series I showed from Catherine Herridge, that there was open social media precursors to the attack. And then this next clip I want to show kind of follows up on this theme, or the last one in this theme is Elizabeth Palmer, the reporter on CBS's Face the Nation. First, she gives a general report on some of the latest facts, and then also talks about the lack of chatter, but in her case, she puts the responsibility for lack of chatter on the overwhelming number of subjects to surveil, not on some encryption or ability to go dark, or that they were talking about in a couple of those other clips. Anyway, here's the CBS clip from this morning here.
Good morning, John. Well, a much clearer picture has emerged of what happened. In about 2.5 hours on Friday night, 6 locations were attacked pretty much simultaneously, and at least 7 terrorists were involved. The police say those men are all dead. Paris is in shock, of course, and the country has begun 3 official days of mourning. The police, immediately working with forensics teams, set out to identify these 7 men, and they said they've done it, although they've only named one of them. They were relying on DNA evidence and in some cases body parts, so they sound pretty sure of themselves. The guy they have named is a French citizen. He comes from the Paris suburbs. He's a petty criminal, and he has been on the security services radar since 2010. 2010 when he was apparently radicalized. The search has gone international for accomplices. It turns out that the car that was driven to the Bataclan concert hall was rented by a Belgian citizen. And the police picked him up yesterday. He was trying to get back into Belgium from France. They've also arrested 3 other men from a suburb of Brussels, which is known to be a home to Islamic radicals. And at least one of them say the police was in Paris the day of the attacks. People are wondering why the intelligence services didn't pick up any chatter on these attacks. They were relatively complex. They involved a lot of people, some of whom are dead and some of whom are clearly alive. But the fact is that the security services here have been completely overwhelmed. Not only have there been French citizens who've gone off to Syria to fight and have been coming back who have to be thoroughly checked out. Of course, in the last few months, there have been hundreds of thousands of migrants flooding into Europe in a pretty chaotic fashion. And the security services, frankly, have been very worried that some of them will be coming in as terrorists disguised simply as asylum seekers. That may turn out to have been the case in this instance.
Elizabeth Palmer.
So that CBS report has a brief reference to the possible danger of refugees after taking the position that the reason that they didn't pick up chatter before the attack is because they were overwhelmed by the number of jihadis, not so much that there's some way that they can go dark or encrypt their communications. And that's the last clip I want to show on the whole chatter issue. I think maybe it'll come up again because several of these clips involve multiple issues, but the next few clips all focus on a poorly chosen word that Barack Obama used in an interview he gave with George Stephanopoulos the day before this big attack in Paris. He talked about how ISIS had been contained, and the word contained in the context that he used it was very clearly, I think, talking about their geographical, Islamic State and the territory that they held, and how there have been some progress. There's been some progress recently in taking back some of the territory, but this has become a big issue that Republicans have harped on, and I'll show a couple examples of it after I show the actual clip from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. This is an interview that aired, I think it was on Thursday on Good Morning America, and this is about a 3-minute clip where George Stephanopoulos actually asked him if ISIS was going to, because of the downing of the Russian airliner and possibly the Beirut attack, I can't remember if that was included in the question, if that meant ISIS was starting to move into international terrorism. And you'll see Barack Obama gives a long answer, but the part where he talks about ISIS being contained is pretty clearly talking about being geographically contained, not contained in terms of their terrorist operations. But anyway, I'll talk about that a little more if you watch that answer from Barack Obama to George Stephanopoulos here.
But if ISIS, with affiliates in so many countries right now, even Afghanistan, if they've decided now to go to international terror, that's a game changer, isn't it?
Well, I have to tell you, George, AQAP in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in Yemen, we know has had plots consistently over the last several years to try to bring down an airliner. I think that one of the challenges of these international terrorist organizations is that they don't have to have a huge amount of personnel. If there is a crack in the system, then they potentially can exploit it, and they are looking for these cracks to exploit. What makes ISIL the challenge that it is right now is primarily the fact that they're occupying territory in two countries that aren't governed effectively in those spaces.
Even your friendly critics, Fareed Zakaria, says that what you have on the ground now is not going to be enough. Every couple of months, you're going to be faced with the same choice: back down or double down.
I think what is true is that this has always been a multi-year project, precisely because the governance structures in the Sunni areas of Iraq are weak, and there are none in Syria. And we don't have ground forces there in sufficient numbers to simply march into al-Raqqa in Syria and clean the whole place out. And as a consequence, we've always understood that our goal has to be militarily constraining ISIL's capabilities, cutting off their supply lines, cutting off their financing.
ISIS is gaining strength, aren't they?
Well, I don't think they're gaining strength. What is true is that from the start, our goal has been first to contain, and we have contained them. They have not gained ground in Iraq, and in Syria, they'll come in, they'll leave, but you don't see this systematic march by ISIL across the terrain. What we have not yet been able to do is to completely decapitate their command and control structures. We've made some progress in trying to reduce the flow of foreign fighters, and part of our goal has to be to recruit more effective Sunni partners in Iraq to really go on offense rather than simply engage in defense.
Now, whatever you think of that answer from President Barack Obama, I think it's pretty clear that when he said that ISIS had been contained, he was talking about it being geographically contained in terms of territory in Iraq and Syria, because the United States has recently made some territorial gains after long-term effort. But, of course, that didn't stop several Republicans from taking it out of context and showing it as an example of President Obama being out of touch or having a failed strategy, which he may or may not have, but I'm just saying that the word contained is not a good way to attack his policy, even if you think his policy deserves attack. And one example I'm going to give is over on CBS's Face the Nation, they did something I usually criticize Fox News Sunday for, which is having a discussion about an issue with two Republicans, which isn't very fair and balanced, and especially that's true in a case like this where they're both attacking the president, Barack Obama's foreign policy. I guess there's like a slight explanation for why, or justification for why CBS might have done this, because it's Senator Richard Burr and Representative Devin Nunes, and they're respectively the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee and the House Intelligence Committee, and so they're kind of appearing in nonpartisan roles, but they seem pretty partisan, attacking President Obama's foreign policy, and they both, you'll see, make references to the word containment over in this clip.
But I think Devin hit on the key. We've got to have a strategy. We don't have a strategy in Syria as it relates to ISIL. The president talked the other morning about ISIL was contained. America learned within 24 hours it's not contained. It's rampant everywhere in the world that they intend to carry out these horrific acts. It just so happens the United States is a target, but Paris was easier. And if we don't get a strategy, tactics don't make a strategy. So these pinpricks that we've had as far as the tactical effort in Syria really is not a strategy. We've got to have a strategy, and hopefully, President Hollande will call Article 5 of NATO in, and maybe we'll put together a coalition that can, for once, attack this horrific terrorist element before they have the ability to carry out another coordinated attack like this.
Chairman Nunes, let's talk about that strategy. If you were to create one and author one, it would presumably have a piece that deals with Syria and Iraq, but then also an intelligence piece for protecting America. What would that strategy look like for you?
Well, I think more than that, John. The point that I've made all along about ISIS is that the president has tried to talk about and developed a containment strategy for Iraq and Syria, when ISIS is stretched from Morocco to the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. So we just saw just a couple weeks ago what appears to be an ISIS attack on a Russian jetliner coming out of Egypt. We continue to, a lot of people talk about the migration of fighters flowing out of Iraq and Syria into Europe, but what they forget is there's many people, migrants coming out of North Africa. So you can't fight ISIS unless you are willing to put a strategy together that deals with North Africa, the failure in Libya, the problems in the Sinai, Iraq and Syria, and the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. And then, and I think more complicated, is what are the Europeans going to do now that it appears like ISIS has rooted themselves into Europe with a command and control structure?
Chairman Burr, you mentioned NATO, and
so you saw there on CBS's Face the Nation, they had on two Republicans who both keyed in on this word containment from the president's statement before the attack in Paris, and who both used it as an opportunity to criticize the president and to criticize his foreign policy generally and his lack of strategy to attack ISIS. And of course, since that is a Republican talking point, obviously that was part of a question over on Fox News Sunday when they had on an official from the Obama administration. This is Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes, who I'm pretty sure did the so-called full Ginsburg. I think he was on all 5 programs. I only have clips of him from 4 of the 5, but I think he was on all 5. And anyway, here he is responding to Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday, who questioned him about President Obama using the word containment, and he basically made the argument that it was geographical containment over here.
On Thursday, President Obama was asked how we are doing in the war against ISIS, and here is what he said.
Our goal has been first to contain, and we have contained them.
We have contained ISIS, and then just a day later, ISIS launches the deadliest attack on Paris since World War II. Mr. Rhodes, hasn't the president, haven't all of you around him, haven't you profoundly misjudged the strength, the capabilities, and the ambitions of ISIS?
No, look, Chris, at the very beginning of the counter-ISIL campaign, the president made very clear that this is going to be a long-term challenge, that this is going to involve a group that poses a threat to our homeland, to our allies. What the president was referring to very specifically is we had to stop their geographic advance in Iraq and Syria, where they were gaining more territory. We have done that. In some respects, we have rolled them back in different places of northern Iraq and northern and eastern Syria. That's necessary to shrink the space that they operate in. But that does not eliminate the threat, as we saw so tragically in Paris. And that's why we have to be relentless in degrading the leadership
But I was just going to say, Mr. Rhodes, haven't you... you're fighting the last war against ISIS. They have changed their tactics. They apparently have brought down an a Russian airliner over Egypt. They had a suicide bomb that killed dozens in Beirut. They now have slaughtered 130 and wounded hundreds more in Paris. This kind of geographical containment isn't where ISIS is anymore.
Well, first of all, they still very much depend on their safe havens in Iraq and Syria. Those must be denied to ISIL. We see them having a global reach, trying to set up operations in different places. That's why we took a strike at the leader of ISIL in Libya just a few days ago. At the same time, the types of threats that you referenced that led to such tragic acts of terror, those have to be dealt with through a variety of means, to include military pressure, to include effective intelligence sharing and counterterrorism work with our allies and partners. That's going to need the cooperation of the whole world. That will clearly be a focus here in Turkey. How are we sharing information? How are we sealing that border with Turkey? And how are we dealing with a terrorist network that has ambitions to launch these type of external attacks?
Mr.
So that's how President Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes responded to that whole question of whether Obama said ISIS had been contained right before this big attack in Paris. And I want to follow that up with a few more clips from Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes, answering some additional questions. First, another one from Fox News Sunday, where he answered a question that he basically got asked on all the programs about whether, I mentioned this earlier, about whether France, since France was saying this is an act of war, if they were going to invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which basically says an attack on one NATO nation is an attack on all NATO nations, and whether the United States would support that and respond to it and go to war with ISIS. And you'll see in this answer, Ben Rhodes said the same thing he said on all the programs where he was asked this question, which is he said that's up to the French, and we are at war with ISIS, and we're going to continue doing what we're already doing, is basically how he answered it over in this clip.
Now, the French are at least considering the idea of invoking Article 5 of NATO, which says that an attack against one is an attack against all. If they do that, would we go along with the French that it is an Article 5 violation? And specifically, are we talking about more of the same, or are we talking about, for instance, putting boots on the ground, combat troops on the ground to take on ISIS in Syria?
Well, Chris, that's a French determination. It's up to a nation to decide whether or not to invoke Article 5. I think we would stand shoulder to shoulder with France in whatever decision they make. In any case, we're going to be cooperating with them militarily going forward. I think what you are going to see is continued intensification of the air campaign, the type of leadership strikes that we've taken in recent days as against Jihadi John in Syria, more direct equipping and arming of opposition forces that are fighting on the ground in both Syria and Iraq. We do not believe that there is a solution to the challenge in Syria or Iraq that involves significant numbers of U.S. combat troops going in. What there needs to be is a mix of relentless counterterrorism pressure and the type of political resolution to the Syrian war that was being pursued in Vienna yesterday with all of the key nations involved.
And just to reiterate what I was saying about how Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes gave similar answers to that question on all the shows, I want to show the way NBC's Chuck Todd on Meet the Press asked a somewhat similar question about it being an act of war, and got a very similar answer from Ben Rhodes over in this clip.
Earlier this week, President Obama said ISIS had been contained, a phrase he's probably regretting right now. And even that was a retreat from an earlier declaration and position when he said the U.S. aim was to degrade and destroy ISIS. Joining me now to talk about the U.S. response to the attacks and the strategy going forward is Ben Rhodes. He's Deputy National Security Advisor for the President, and he's traveling with him in Turkey. Mr. Rhodes, welcome to Meet the Press.
Good to be with you, Chuck.
Let me start with French President Hollande called this an act of war. Does the President concur that this was an act of war, and does that change America's footing?
We absolutely agree that this was an act of war, and our hearts go out to the people of Paris who suffered this terrible attack. The fact is, Chuck, we've been at war with ISIL for some time. Over more than a year now, we've conducted thousands of airstrikes. We provide arms to forces who are fighting them on the ground. But this is going to be a long-term campaign to disrupt and ultimately defeat ISIL, and we're going to have to continue to redouble our efforts in partnership with allies like France.
You know, a year ago...
And the last clip I want to show of Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes is over from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, where George asked him about one of the policies he was advocating in one of those earlier clips, that saying that the United States is having success because we're going after the leadership. Here you'll see George Stephanopoulos asking him if those leadership decapitation attacks are even... if they're all that helpful, and of course he says yes over in this clip.
Decapitation strikes making any difference?
Well, George, it's going to take time. This is going to be a long-term effort. This is a deeply entrenched group. It's been in this part of the world for many years. It has its origins in al-Qaeda in Iraq. It morphed into ISIL. This threat is going to be with us for some time, but we have built an infrastructure of airstrikes, of the ability to train and equip forces on the ground, of intelligence that can lead to those types of leadership targets. And so our expectation is, as we continue to intensify those efforts, hope to draw in more resources from our coalition partners, we'll be able to roll back ISIL and ultimately achieve that objective of defeating the organization.
You know,
So that's the last clip I want to show of from the Obama administration responding to this. That's the person that the Obama administration put out there this morning was their Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, who he's on the National Security Council, but he's more political than security or defense, or he doesn't come from that background. He comes more from a White House political background. So that's who the White House put out to answer these questions this morning. I want to show a clip of another Democrat before I move over to the Republican candidates and how they reacted in a very hawkish way. And since I'm going to show all those clips of very hawkish Republicans, I want to show a somewhat hawkish Democrat. This is Representative Adam Schiff, who seems to be advocating more Turkish ground troops and maybe more American ground troops in response to a question from George Stephanopoulos on ABC's This Week about if there was failure that caused this, failure in the ISIS strategy that resulted in this Paris attack. What are the changes that should result from that failure? And you can see that answer here.
Congressman Schiff, you used the word failure just a moment ago. If this indeed was a failure, what should be done about it? What exactly should the United States and the president be doing right now?
Well, we're certainly going to intensify our intelligence cooperation, but we've been doing that already. I think that the chief failure here is we cannot allow ISIS to have this unmolested sanctuary in Syria and Iraq from which to plan and direct attacks against us, because some of those attacks will get through. In the first year of its existence, it focused on building its caliphate. Now, in the second year, it has focused on opening a second front and attacking the West. It has the aspiration to attack us here at home, and being on defense through the use of these intelligence resources is simply not enough. We're going to have to further constrain its space. And I think it'll be interesting, George, to see whether the president can get some commitment from Turkey to employ Turkish troops to protect the safe zone that Turkey ostensibly wants to create.
He is there right now.
So it sounds like Turkish troops may be something that we can expect to happen in the near future. President Obama was actually at this G20 summit, and he met and publicly spoke to the press with the president of Turkey. So they may have been in some negotiations. That was reported. I'm not sure I have a clip exactly on that, but I have one more clip on the Paris attack before I move on to the 2016 presidential race, although, like I said at the beginning, a lot of those clips also deal with the Paris attack, but they do it in the context of the political campaign, so I separated those clips out, even though it's more about the Paris attack. But the last clip I want to show is another one from the Republican Republican chair of the House Homeland Security Committee. This is Representative Mike McCall from Texas, who is, I'm trying to remember, which show was he on? Oh, over on NBC's Meet the Press. Actually, Andrea Mitchell, the reporter, asked him about whether, how should we approach the problem in Syria, and he also made a reference to the president's mention of the word containment in a critical way, but then he said something that kind of I thought was problematic, that you'll see some of the Republican candidates also mention, which is that we have to get rid of these rules of engagement, which basically means we have to be not so careful about not killing civilians. And that even becomes more clear in some of the clips from Republican candidates I'll show in a minute. But first, here's Representative Mike McCall telling that to Andrea Mitchell on NBC's Meet the Press this morning here.
Congressman McCall, Ben Rhodes said that we are arming foreign fighters. He's talking, I guess, about the Peshmerga, but the signature failure has been the failure to stand up the Syrian resistance against Assad. Where do you stand on that? What should the administration do now that Paris has happened? Hasn't this changed the whole equation?
I think Paris changes everything. It should galvanize the entire world behind our efforts to defeat and destroy ISIS, not just to contain them. That's been the policy of this administration, has been containment only. And when the president said that ISIS has been contained, I would hate to see what ISIS looks like unleashed. I mean, we've had 3 major external operations, and and the latest being in Paris, the Russian airliner. These traditionally look like more sophisticated al-Qaeda plots. We're realizing that ISIS now has a capability not just to establish a caliphate, but then expand this mission beyond and conduct external operations. We need to have NATO coalition forces in there. We need airstrikes that don't have rules of engagement behind them. And we need to have the Sunni Arabs putting skin in the game to protect their own backyard and their own religion.
Jennifer Rubio.
So that's Representative Mike McCall talking about how we have to get rid of these rules of engagement, which is kind of scary because the United States already has a lot of collateral damage, has killed a lot of civilians, and I think it could get a lot worse if that kind of policy is pursued. And so, like I said, that's the last clip I want to show just on the Paris attacks, but the Paris attacks also were a big topic in the 2016 presidential campaign, at least as it's developed over the last few days since Friday afternoon, my time at least, when the news of these attacks first broke that I heard about it. And the first clip I want to show is on the same topic that Mike McCall, the Republican from Texas, was talking about there, about whether we should be more willing to cause civilian casualties. This is Senator Marco Rubio, who some people say is the odds-on favorite to be the nominee of the Republican Party for the 2016 presidential campaign. Here, George Stephanopoulos asks him about something Senator Ted Cruz said, who's another person who is supposedly doing well in the campaign. And so George Stephanopoulos asks Marco Rubio about Ted Cruz's claim that we need to be less concerned about civilian casualties, and Marco Rubio pretty much agrees, and then says a couple things about how America's very careful, which is, I don't know, somewhat true that, we have more rules of engagement than some countries, I guess, but we still do cause a lot of collateral damage and civilian casualties, even if we're not actually targeting civilians. And then he also says that ISIS has killed a lot more civilians than America ever has, and that I don't think is true at all. Even in the context of this conflict, I think the casualties, even the civilian casualties in the Iraq War, were, over 100,000, even by fairly conservative estimates. So anyway, I pretty much criticized what Marco Rubio said before I showed the clip, but here's the clip of Marco Rubio saying it on ABC this morning in this clip.
Senator Ted Cruz said over the weekend that we have to dramatically ramp up the airstrikes, even if it means more civilian casualties.
Well, look, I don't think any nation on earth takes more pains in avoiding civilian casualties than the United States. The reality, unfortunately, is that many of these terrorist groups deliberately operate from the center of civilian areas because they want there to be civilian casualties for propaganda use. We've seen that as well used by the enemies of Israel on repeated occasions. Obviously, we're going to take great pains to avoid civilian casualties, but at the end of the day, no one's killed more civilians and more innocents here than ISIS has. And although we'll take extraordinary steps to avoid civilian casualties, there's, of course, no guarantee, especially given the fact that you're operating against these individuals who have no regard for human life.
So I pre-criticized that clip before I showed it, but I disagree with a couple of the basic premises of what Senator Marco Rubio said there about the U.S. or about ISIS being responsible for more civilian deaths than the United States. I'm not sure where he's getting his numbers, but the U.S., even though the U.S. has a policy of not targeting civilians, which, like I was saying, that's a step up from some of the other countries around the world, and certainly makes it different from what ISIS is doing in Paris. The United States military action has been responsible for more civilian casualties, I think, than ISIS has been responsible for. I haven't really added up the exact numbers, but just based on the civilian casualties in the Iraq War, I think you can already outnumber any attacks by ISIS. You can tell me down in the comment section if I'm adding the numbers wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's correct. And having shown that clip of Marco Rubio reacting to Ted Cruz's claim we need more civilian casualties or need to be less concerned about them, I want to show a clip from NBC's Meet the Press talking about reaction from several Republican candidates to the Paris attacks. One of the most inane responses, I think, is from Donald Trump here, which I don't know. I don't know the context of the clip, but at least the way it's shown here on Meet the Press, it sounds like he's saying the solution to what happened in Paris is they needed to have more guns. And that's in the middle of a few other Republican candidates here.
As we've already seen, the Paris attacks played a big part in last night's Democratic debate, but the Republican presidential candidates have also been reacting. Here is a sample.
We ask that our leaders understand this is not some random, ill-defined, violent extremism. This evil, radical Islamic terrorism needs to be called out.
You can say what you want, but if they had guns, if our people had guns, if they were allowed to carry, it would have been a much, much different situation.
If we take in, thousands of people from that area, it would be almost malpractice of the global jihadists not to infiltrate them with their people.
I am angry that just yesterday morning, our president, against all evidence, declared ISIS contained and took a victory lap. ISIS is not a JV team, Mr. President. They are not contained. They are at our shores, and they measure their victory in body count.
This is a clash of civilizations, and either they win or we win.
So that was the NBC Meet the Press clip roundup from the Republican candidates. Like I said, Donald Trump claiming they need more guns. Is that really what he said in context? Because that is not the right solution, I don't think. And you notice the Ted Cruz clip at the beginning wasn't about needing to cause more or be less concerned about civilian casualties. It was actually this claim that the problem is President Obama won't call it as Islam. They talk about jihadists or extremists, but they don't call it radical Islam because they don't want to use the word Islam. And given the way that they've taken President Obama's use of the word contained out of context, at least to some extent, I can see why they don't want to use the word Islam. So that can be taken out of context by especially when they are also translating it into Arabic or for propaganda purposes. That, I mean, I've talked about this on programs before that while I personally have no problem calling radical Islam and saying that's a problem, or calling them jihadists or Islamists, or in general it's not a problem to talk about radical Islam, but I understand why officials of the U.S. government don't want to call it radical Islam, why the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, when she was, and the President of the United States, they don't want to use the words radical Islam because they don't want to use the word Islam at all in terms of who we're fighting, because that can be used for propaganda purposes by the radical Islamists to say that it's a war against Islam. And that goes all the way back to George W. Bush, and that's the next clip I want to show makes that point. It's from CNN's State of the Union. Jake Tapper asked Jeb Bush, this is the one Jeb clip I'm going to show, if Hillary Clinton is right, that George W. Bush was right to say that they shouldn't say it's a war against Islam, or say anything that is even close to that, so that no one even thinks it'll be a war against Islam. And I think later when I get to the Democratic side of the race, in the clip roundup from that, I show Hillary Clinton saying that George W. Bush was right on this one point. But here's how Jeb reacts to that. And it's kind of interesting because he won't contradict George W. Bush in this clip. And he won't really say it's radical Islam either over here.
Last night tweaked Hillary Clinton and the other Democratic candidates for being unwilling to use the phrase radical Islamic terrorism at the debate. Hillary Clinton said she's following the example of your brother, George W. Bush, after 9/11. Take a listen to this.
The face of terror is not the true faith of Islam. That's not what Islam is all about. Islam is peace. These terrorists don't represent peace. They represent evil and war.
Is Islam peace, Governor?
You know what? I know what Islamic terrorism is, and that's what we were fighting with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, all of the other groups, and that's what our focus should be on. This is not a question of religion. This is a political ideology that has co-opted a religion. And I think it's more than acceptable to call it for what it is and then organize an effort to destroy it.
I guess the question is, though, Hillary Clinton said she doesn't want to label it as Islamic terrorism, and that seemed to be, at least in the first few years of the war on terror under President Bush, your brother, his blueprint as well. And he said Islam is peace. It's hard to imagine Hillary Clinton saying Islam is peace and not being attacked by Republicans.
All I know is that she does not believe that this is our fight. This is a fight for Western civilization. We need to be all in on it. And the simple fact is that these are Islamic terrorists that have co-opted a faith that is peaceful. But nevertheless, this is something we need to fight. And I don't think anybody would question that my brother was in that fight, that he viewed it as a national security fight, and he led. And that's what we need to do again.
So I guess at the end, Jeb does kind of say they are Islamists, but he kind of defended Hillary Clinton, or more specifically his brother George W. Bush, and was continuing to defend George W., which is one of his weaknesses as a candidate, I guess. And then the next clip I want to show is also on this radical Islam question. This is Marco Rubio responding to, I think actually, this is where George Stephanopoulos shows a clip of what Hillary Clinton said in the debate, where she says the one thing George W. Bush was right about is not calling it Islam. And Marco Rubio, of course, totally disagrees, as I'll discuss after you watch that clip over here.
Marco Rubio, also running for president, said that this attack showed, and the attack in Paris showed, that we are at war with radical Islam. Do you agree with that characterization, radical Islam?
I don't think we're at war with Islam. I don't think we're at war with all Muslims. I think we're at war with jihadists. We are at war with violent extremism. We are at war with people who use their religion for purposes of power and oppression. And yes, we are at war with those people, but I don't want us to be painting with too broad a brush.
Seen from last night's Democratic debate, and we're joined now by the man invoked in that question, Senator Marco Rubio, also running for president, member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Senator Rubio, thank you for joining us this morning. You saw Secretary Clinton there, did not want to use the words radical Islam. Your response?
I don't understand it. That would be like saying we weren't at war with Nazis because we were afraid to offend some Germans who may have been members of the Nazi Party but weren't violent themselves. We are at war with radical Islam, with an interpretation of Islam by a significant number of people around the world who they believe now justifies them in killing those who don't agree with their ideology. This is a clash of civilizations. And as I said at the debate earlier this week, there is no middle ground on this. Either they win or we win. And we need to begin to take this seriously. These are individuals motivated by their faith. Of course, all Muslims are not members of violent jihadist groups. But there is a global jihadist movement in the world motivated by their interpretation of Islam, in this case, Sunni Islam, in the case of ISIS, and it needs to be confronted for what it is. This is not a geopolitical movement. This is a religiously oriented movement.
We did just...
So that's Senator Marco Rubio doubling down, I guess, on his statement. Or, I mean, I think that's actually an argument that most people will agree more with Senator Marco Rubio than Hillary Clinton, because, like I said, I'm very comfortable saying that it's radical Islam, even though I have criticized some people like Bill Maher, and I will near the end of the show, where I think he overgeneralizes about Muslims on occasion, but that doesn't mean you can't call radical Islam. I've just recognize that there's a diplomatic reason for the United States government not to use the term radical Islam or in any way to characterize the opponent we are fighting as Islam, because it can be taken out of context and used as propaganda by the people we are fighting to say that it's a war against Islam, where they can just drop the radical part. And the whole Nazi comparison that Marco Rubio made there, that is like the weakest. That's a really weak argument. I don't even know how he can get away with that, because to say that we're refusing to say Nazi, Nazism is an ideology that is not really the same as the ideology of Islam. There are plenty of people who read the religious texts and who go to mosques and who really take the Muslim religion to heart and don't get anything violent out of it. And I don't think you can say the same thing about Nazis, even if some Nazis weren't actually violent. The ideology of Nazism, talk about your mother load of bad ideas. It's as if, I think a better analogy is if people had called Nazis radical Catholics, since Adolf Hitler was a Catholic after all, and they used a lot of pagan imagery, but they also used a lot of Christian imagery and Nazi propaganda. And so, the United States is a mostly Protestant nation, so we were, World War II was the Protestants fighting the radical Catholics of Nazism. That would be a more apt analogy, I think, because there is actually kind of a history of Protestant versus Catholic wars in, not in the United States and Europe, but in Europe itself. So it actually fits a little better, radical Islam with Nazism being radical Catholicism. Not that Nazism has anything to do with Catholicism, but not that radical Islam has anything to do with Islam, really. That's the whole point, and that's why Marco Rubio is totally wrong in his argument there. And the next clip I want to show is also from Senator Marco Rubio. This is also from that same interview with George Stephanopoulos on ABC, where George Stephanopoulos asks him about an attack he's getting from one of his fellow Republican presidential candidates, Senator Rand Paul, about whether he opposed vetting of immigrants. This is bringing up the whole danger of the Syrian refugees. And here's how Marco Rubio deals with that. And he says vetting is impossible, by the way, in this clip.
Some evidence that one of those attackers in Paris may have been a refugee from Syria coming through Greece. They're not completely sure of that yet, but it has put a lot of attention on the president's decision to increase the number of refugees from Syria. And it's also creating some criticism for you from one of your rivals. Rand Paul says that a couple of years ago on the immigration bill, you blocked an amendment that would have made it more difficult for refugees with a terrorist past to get in. I want to show what he said.
2-3 years ago, I introduced a bill or an amendment to the immigration bill that would have provided for more scrutiny for people coming into our country. Refugees, immigrants, students. They would have had background checks. Mine was a national security amendment as well as an immigration amendment, and Marco blocked it.
Your response?
Well, look, Rand just uses this sort of rhetoric to distract from his very weak record on national security issues. He's been one of the leading figures trying to gut the American intelligence programs. Think about the metadata program for a moment. Imagine if one of those strikes had occurred here in the United States. The first thing we would want to know is, what are the cell phone records of these people? Let's say that, God forbid, what happened in Paris happened in Washington. We would want to know, we would want access to these people's phone records, because it would give us clues as to who they were working with, who probably may be involved in plots themselves later on down the road. Rand Paul wants to get rid of that program. In fact, he's advocated it, and he's one of the leading figures behind part of that program being gutted now.
But did you, in
of
fact,
course,
block an amendment that would have required more background checks?
Listen, the background checks are required now. The problem is not the background checks. The problem is we can't background check them. You can't pick up the phone and call Syria, and that's one of the reasons why I've said we won't be able to take more refugees. It's not that we don't want to, it's that we can't, because there's no way to background check someone that's coming from Syria. Who do you call and do a background check on them? The bottom line is that this is not just a threat coming from abroad. What we need to open up to and realize is that we have a threat here at home. Homegrown violent extremists, individuals that perhaps have not even traveled abroad, who have been radicalized online. This has become a multifaceted threat. In the case of what's happening in Europe, this is a swarm of refugees, and as I've said repeatedly over the last few months, you can have 1,000 people come in, and 999 of them are just poor people fleeing, oppression and violence. But one of them is an ISIS fighter. If that's the case, you have a problem, and there's no way to vet that out. There's no background check system in the world that allows us to find that out. Because who do you call in Syria to background check them?
How have these attacks?
So that's a fairly sophisticated argument there, but it really boils down to one word, which is xenophobia. And I don't know if you look up xenophobia in the dictionary, I think it will be fear of the stranger, fear of the foreigner, or something like that. So, I mean, it's not impossible that there are Syrian refugees who are stealth sleeper ISIS fighters who are coming to attack us, but I think in a clip I'm not going to show that Ben Rhodes was, or it wasn't even Ben Rhodes, I think it was actually Jeb Bush talking about when he was talking about how he wanted us to let more Christian refugees into the country. He was asked how we would know they were Christian. He said, "Oh, we vet them really well for like a year. It takes a year to get into the country, and they do all this vetting by, you don't have to necessarily call Syria to vet people who are refugees from Syria. You can actually keep them in various states of, I guess, detention or refugee holding camps while they're being vetted for a long period of time. And I don't know, I guess some people might be able to get through that, but it's certainly not a way to become operational in a few months like apparently happened in the Paris attack. Anyway, that was the last clip I want to show of Senator Marco Rubio, but having shown several clips of Senator Marco Rubio, I want to show a clip of Bill Maher in his monologue making some jokes. Even though the Paris attacks happened a few hours before Real Time with Bill Maher aired live, I should say, they still kept a lot of their prepared material, including the monologue. He started the monologue by trying to sing like the first verse of the Marseillaise, not very well, but showing his solidarity with the French, I guess. And I'm not going to question his integrity in that sense, just his singing voice, I guess. But here's, I guess, these were prepared jokes before the attack in Paris. Bill Maher making fun of something that Marco Rubio said in that Republican debate on the Fox Business Network about welders being better paid and more important than philosophers over in this clip.
But the line of the night belonged to Marco Rubio, who, well, of course, Marco Rubio, first, of course, every time he talks, has to tell you his personal story. Came from Cuban immigrants. My mother was a maid. I was in Menudo. Okay. Okay, we get it. But he said something the audience just loved. He said, welders make more money than philosophers. Not close to true. But the crowd loved it because it sent a powerful message. Knowledge is stupid. And they loved that message. But actually, a welder makes on average $37,000 a year, and a philosophy grad makes over $80,000. For you Republicans, let me clarify, the second number is bigger. And also, you know who was a philosopher? Jesus. But if he'd been a welder, he could have cut himself down from the cross and gotten out of there.
So I don't know how appropriate jokes are in the context of the Paris attacks, but I guess I'm like 48 hours after when Bill Maher actually made those jokes in his monologue, although, like I said, he did start off, just like Saturday Night Live started off with one of their performers making a statement in solidarity with Paris and with France, and even making a statement in French, kind of like what, but a much better speaking of the French language than what Bill Maher did at the beginning of his program, although I don't have either of those clips that I'm going to show in my program, but I will have a couple more Bill Maher comedy clips and non-comedy clips, and then a couple clips from Saturday Night Live a little later in the program. But I want to finish up with the Republican candidates. First, I want to show one clip from Senator Lindsey Graham. He's like barely in the race. I don't even think he qualified for the undercard debate in the Fox Business debate. So he was like totally off any of the stages, because I guess that means he basically registers as 0 in the polls. But that didn't stop him from his appearance this morning. Let me make sure I have this right. This is over on CNN's State of the Union, though it didn't make it into the rebroadcast. This was in the earlier morning broadcast. He was talking about, Jake Tapper actually asked him why he was one of only 2 candidates who favored ground troops in this whole Syrian conflict, and those candidates aren't doing really well. And he, of course, responded saying, well, he doesn't care about the politics, he's just into good policy, and more ground troops apparently is good policy over in this clip.
Senator Graham, you and Senator Rick Santorum are the only 2 Republican presidential candidates calling for more boots on the ground in Iraq and or Syria, and yet you and Senator Santorum are not doing particularly well, at least when it comes to polls. Why is it, do you think, that those who are not calling for that, not calling for more boots on the ground in Iraq and Syria, are thriving in the Republican primary race?
You know, I can't explain the politics. I can only tell you what I've learned after 35 trips to Iraq and Afghanistan in the last decade, trying to understand this war. Number one, Obama's strategy against ISIL is failing. It will not work. You're only going to win this war if you go on offense. You'll never win the war from the air. So what I'm pleading with every Republican, I hope Hillary Clinton, I hope the president will listen to what I'm saying. We don't have until the next election to deal with ISIL. There is a 9/11 coming, and it's coming from Syria if we don't disrupt their operations inside of Syria. So what I'm suggesting to the president, to Democrats and Republicans, listen to what I have been saying and follow my advice. The Arabs in Turkey want to destroy ISIL as much as we do. France is now a victim twice of this organization. Let's rally the world, form an army that is there to be formed, lead it, going on the ground and destroy ISIL before they attack our country. I'm not trying to have pride of authorship here. I'm trying to protect America from another 9/11. And without American boots on the ground in Syria and Iraq, we're going to get here at home. And if you don't understand that, you're not ready to be commander-in-chief, in my view.
Senator, if the Arabs, such as Jordan and the Saudis and the UAE and Qatar and Egypt and the Turks are eager to get in this fight, where are they?
The reason they're eager to get in the fight, but they're not going to go in and destroy ISIL unless we take a side out too. No Arab nation is going to fight just for ISIL. Turkey is not going to go in on the ground and fight ISIL and leave Assad in power. That's the problem with Obama's strategy. He is leaving Assad in power. That means you're giving Damascus to the Iranians. To get a regional force, you have to accomplish 2 goals: to go in to destroy ISIL, which is a threat to the region, and also take out Assad, who's a puppet of Iran. Without putting Assad on the table, you're not going to be able to rally the region. I hope the French will invoke Article 5. They should. The world should be at war with ISIL. And if I'm the commander-in-chief of the American component, we will be part of a worldwide force to destroy ISIL, and we will not leave Assad in power. I am not going to give yet another Arab capital to the Iranians.
So that argument isn't working very well in the Republican presidential campaign, at least according to the polls. There haven't been any votes yet, but having shown that one clip of Lindsey Graham, and I originally chose that because the first time I heard that whole exchange, I almost thought Lindsey Graham was saying that the Turks are Arab, but then when I listened to it again, I think he might have said that it wasn't the Arabs in Turkey, it was the Arabs and Turkey, and then the questioning, I wasn't sure whether Jake Tapper was saying that the Turks and the Arabs, or whether he was claiming that Turkey was the people in Turkey were Arab, because of course the Turks aren't Arabs, but on listening to it a couple more times, I'm not even sure that's what he was saying. But having shown Senator Lindsey Graham and his arguments, which aren't getting a lot of traction, though who knows, maybe if there's a big terrorist attack in the United States to follow up on the one in Paris, that would turn his campaign around, as gruesome as thinking about those political implications might be. I want to show a candidate who may actually be suffering from defense and national security being put on the front burner now from this Paris attack. That's Dr. Ben Carson, who was over on Fox News Sunday talking to host Chris Wallace, who's admitted in the past that he's a friend of Dr. Ben Carson's, but he actually asked a couple fairly confrontational questions. In this first clip, he asked him about some kind of crazy statements he's made about Syria. First about China being involved in Syria, which he kind of backs off a little and just says not Chinese troops, but Chinese weapons and maybe people to teach them how to use the weapons, or I don't know. That's kind of the first part of this clip. And then much worse is the second part of the clip, where he talks about his idea to have a no-fly zone, including shooting down Russian planes and what would happen if they shoot down one of our planes? Well, his answer to that is, we'll see what happens, over in this clip.
That this is a turning point, if you will, in the presidential campaign, because we're now talking not just about electing a president, but electing a commander-in-chief, somebody to keep the country safe. You surprised a lot of people in the last debate when you said this about Syria.
We also must recognize that it's a very complex place. The Chinese are there as well as the Russians, and you have all kinds of factions there.
Briefly, sir, what evidence do you have that the Chinese are fighting in Syria?
I didn't say that they were fighting there. I said they're involved. They're involved by supplying weapons, which we have asked them not to do, but they continue to do anyway. Some are very sophisticated and obviously are going to require support in order to operate.
You also said that the U.S., and you have said for some time, should establish a no-fly zone over parts of Syria where the anti-Assad rebels are. And you said that if the Russians were to violate that, we should be prepared to shoot them down. Here you are on that.
If they do come into that area, after you have given them adequate warning, after we've talked to Putin, you shoot them down, absolutely.
Dr. Carson, what happens if the Russians respond to that by shooting down one of our planes?
I would do that in conjunction with the Turkish forces along the Syrian-Turkish border, where a huge number of those refugees are located. It's a humanitarian thing to try to provide them a safe haven for now.
But sir, if I may
press that the Russians understood that we were going to do that.
If I may press my point, what do you do if after we shoot down a Russian plane, they shoot down one of ours?
If they violate it, we will in fact enforce it, and we'll see what happens. For us to always be backing down because we're afraid of a conflict, that's not how we became a great nation, Chris.
But you're talking about getting potentially into a shooting war with Russia over Syria?
Well, if we establish the no-fly zone and we make clear the rules, if they violate it, that's why you have a no-fly zone. That's the very definition of a no-fly zone. You can't fly there.
Finally, sir.
I don't see how that kind of answer is going to give a lot of confidence even to Republican primary voters. I mean, maybe evangelicals who are looking forward to Armageddon and the second coming. Maybe they'll like that answer, but we'll see what happens if we shoot down the Russian planes. That I think one of the more likely outcomes is like World War III over Syria, which is a really stupid outcome. I don't want to just see what happens. And the second clip I want to show from Dr. Ben Carson is also Chris Wallace being fairly confrontational, being fairly critical of his answers, or being giving good follow-up questions when he asked Dr. Ben Carson about his idea to build an international coalition, just asking him, I don't know if it's an important question, but who he's going to call first. Who are you going to call to start your international coalition? And even though Chris Wallace asks over and over again, Dr. Ben Carson never really answers over in this clip.
Controlling.
If I may, let me just focus on the military component, because obviously after the slaughter of over 100 people, while all of those are important components, the military component is the most immediate one. And you have said that you would, as president, try to create an international coalition militarily to go after ISIS. How would you put that together? Who would you call first?
Well, what I was just explaining is, how we use the resources that we have. That includes some of our special ops people working in conjunction with an effective fighting force there. Those are the kinds of things that will create enthusiasm as we begin to take back the land, take back the areas, and damage their image throughout the world.
But who would you call first, specifically, to put together an international military coalition?
My point being that if we get out there and we really lead, and it appears that we're making progress, then all of the Arab states and even the non-Arab states, who I think are beginning to recognize that the jihad movement is global. It is not just local in the Middle East. But if we fight it there, they will have to pool their resources in that area, and then we won't have to necessarily fight them here. That's what I'm saying.
But can you tell us who you would call first, sir, on the international scene?
I would call for all of the Arab states to be involved in this. I would call for all of our traditional allies to be involved in this. I don't want to leave anybody out, because really this is, when you're talking about a global jihad movement, you're talking about a movement whose eventual goal is to dominate the entire world. And I think a lot of people...
Well, I'm sorry, sir, but I
that.
just want to ask you, you talk about...
So, yeah, that was Dr. Ben Carson not really being able to or being willing to answer the question about who he was going to call first to form his international coalition. And I guess that was about 4 minutes of Dr. Ben Carson in those two clips. I was checking out the comments while I was playing those clips from the live broadcast here, the live comments. A couple people saying they did not want any more Ben Carson, that he is kind of human NyQuil or something like that I saw in there. And that was the last Dr. Ben Carson clip. And I guess if you need a little waking up, I'll add in a little more political comedy here. This is the second clip from Bill Maher's monologue last Friday, where he talked about how Donald Trump had kind of had a meltdown this last week, which was one of the bigger pieces of news before the Paris attacks. And Donald Trump's meltdown was really in response to being surpassed in the polls by Dr. Ben Carson. And this is, I think, another example of how Bill Maher had a lot of material prepared, comedy material prepared before the Paris attacks, which, of course, only happened like 2 or 3 hours before he airs his show live. So here's some of his prepared comedy about Donald Trump's meltdown in response to Ben Carson here.
Of course, in this country, it's Friday the 13th, and Donald Trump had a meltdown. That shows you the difference between... Did you see the Trump meltdown? This is what we have all been waiting for. Apparently, coming in second to Dr. Ben Carson is really getting under his skin. Donald Trump used to begin his speeches with, I'm the greatest guy in the world. Now it's all about, I can't believe I'm losing to a black guy. He went totally Charlie Sheen. Seriously, on Dr. Ben Carson, he called him pathological, compared him to a child molester. Donald Trump, the man who could be president, did an elaborate pantomime for quite a few minutes, making fun of the time that Dr. Ben claims when he was a teenager, he tried to stab somebody, with a knife, and it hit the guy's belt buckle, saving him from going to jail. So Trump acts this out and then says, it can't happen, a belt buckle wouldn't do that. Does anybody in the audience have a knife? Try it on me. And the Secret Service agents were like, this isn't in the manual, is it? And then Donald Trump said, how stupid are the people of Iowa? There's a great way to get elected, huh? That they would fall for this story. You know what, Don? We've had our differences. I remember when you sued me, that wasn't cool. But calling evangelical voters fools and idiots for believing in that Jesus redemption bullshit, that's my shtick, okay? And by the way...
So, yeah, I actually like the end of that set of jokes. Though, like I said, it was obviously material that Bill Maher had prepared before the Paris attacks, and it's not really in keeping with the more somber tone of most of that coverage, but it's kind of a strange mix of programming in the United States where on the news programs they're still covering all the mourning and they're covering the investigation, and it's wall-to-wall coverage of these attacks in Paris, but there actually has been some entertainment programming. I noticed on Friday night, Stephen Colbert's Late Show aired a regular program, and then there's this little comment from Stephen Colbert at the end about how it had been recorded before the attacks and showing solidarity with the attacks in Paris. And like I said on Saturday Night Live, they started the show with a statement from Cicely Strong, I think is the person who started the show, with a statement in solidarity with Paris, and then a statement in French. I don't speak French, so I didn't understand. And so, and then they went on to just their regular comedy. And here's a comedy clip. Bill Maher did routine. It's I don't know it is true, or I don't know it to be a fact, but I know it to be true, or something like that. And it has to do with Carly Fiorina. This is the last clip about the Republican side of the race, and it reminded me of something I talked about a few weeks ago in one of my broadcasts that I'll tell you about after you watch this very brief 13-second clip here.
I don't know for a fact that Carly Fiorina has a coat made out of Dalmatians. I just know it's true.
So I thought that was funny, and I think a few weeks ago I talked about how I find Carly Fiorina one of the more annoying or difficult to listen to of all the Republican candidates, and although there are a couple others, but that sometimes I think that what bothers me is that she fits like these sexist stereotypes that are in my brain about, these really overbearingly, I don't know exactly the word to use, and then Bill Maher came up with that Cruella de Vil illusion. I was thinking, oh, that Cruella de Vil is kind of like a sexist stereotype embedded in my brain in childhood, so maybe that's why Carly Fiorina grates against me, or maybe it's just because she's a terrible, terrible person and has nothing to do with gender at all. I don't know. You can let me know what you think down in the comment section, so like I said, that's the last clip on the Republican side, and I actually want to show several clips on the Democratic side of the 2016 presidential race, which was also heavily influenced by the attacks in Paris. I'm going to have a couple clips of Bernie Sanders and a roundup of clips from the Saturday CBS Democratic debate. Let's see, this first clip, let me make sure I get the right one, is Cecilia Vega's report on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos talking about how the Paris attack affected the Democratic debate, and then different views on how to respond to the attack. Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton and Martin O'Malley in the CBS debate over in this clip.
A moment of silence in Iowa, the terror attacks in Paris taking center stage. The three candidates vying for the Democratic nomination united on one thing, the threat of ISIS.
Together leading the world, this country will rid our planet of this barbarous organization called ISIS.
It cannot be contained, it must be defeated.
We have a lot of work to do.
But exactly how to defeat ISIS up for debate.
This cannot be an American fight, although American leadership is essential.
I would disagree with Secretary Clinton respectfully on this score. This actually is America's fight.
Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders going after former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's 2002 Senate vote to invade Iraq.
I would argue that the disastrous invasion of Iraq, something that I strongly opposed, has unraveled the region completely and led to the rise of Al-Qaeda and to ISIS.
But the sharpest exchange of the night about Wall Street.
Why, over her political career, has Wall Street been the major campaign contributor to Hillary Clinton? They expect to get something. Everybody knows that.
He has basically used his answer to impugn my integrity. Let's be frank here. Oh, wait a minute, Senator. You know, not only do I have hundreds of thousands of donors, most of them small, and I'm very proud that for the first time, a majority of my donors are women, 60%.
Despite the cheers, Clinton is now taking heat for invoking 9/11 to defend her ties to Wall Street banks.
I did spend a whole lot of time and effort helping them rebuild. That was good for New York, it was good for the economy, and it was a way to rebuke the terrorists who had attacked our country.
And this debate taking a different tone, in both a somber tone and those attacks from Sanders and O'Malley. Clinton's camp telling me they view this as a win for them, though. But still, what happened in Paris shifting the entire focus of the 2016 race. Now, George, America's fight against ISIS taking center stage.
We're going to talk about.
So I thought that was a good report from Cecilia Vega on ABC that summed up what happened at the Democratic debate. I watched the Democratic debate on CBS, and it did have a heavy influence from the Paris attack, but then there were also some important issues brought up, the whole Wall Street issue and Hillary Clinton using 9/11 to justify her support of Wall Street. Anyway, that was the ABC report. The report I want to show next is fairly similar, but it's the NBC report from Meet the Press. Chuck Todd introduced sort of a clip roundup from the debate, and it's about half as long as the one from ABC over here.
To no one's surprise, the attacks in Paris played a big role in last night's Democratic presidential debate. It was their second encounter. Here's some of what they said on the issue of Paris.
We have to look at ISIS as the leading threat of an international terror network. It cannot be contained, it must be defeated. But it cannot be an American fight. And I think what the president has consistently said, which I agree with, is that we will support those who take the fight to ISIS.
I would disagree with Secretary Clinton respectfully on this score. This actually is America's fight. It cannot solely be America's fight. America is best when we work in collaboration with our allies, but also our role in the world, yes, is also to confront evil when it rises. We took out the safe haven in Afghanistan, but now there is undoubtedly a larger safe haven, and we must rise to this occasion in collaboration and with alliances to confront it.
I don't think any sensible person would disagree that the invasion of Iraq led to the massive level of instability we are seeing right now. I think that was one of the worst foreign policy blunders in the modern history of the United States.
We'll have much.
So that was the roundup of clips from NBC's Meet the Press, more focused on the Paris attacks, not so much on the Wall Street. And then the next roundup of clips actually comes from CBS's Face the Nation. You know, CBS hosted the Democratic debate on Saturday night, and it concludes with John Dickerson showing a poll from CBS that shows Hillary Clinton won the debate, according to the viewers of the debate that CBS polled anyway, by a fairly wide margin. I think it was like 51 to 28%. I think, well, it's at the end of this clip. You can watch for yourself here.
When word came of the multiple attacks in Paris Friday, the roadmap for our CBS News Democratic debate changed dramatically. We had planned to question the candidates about how they would deal with a crisis, but suddenly there was an actual crisis, an escalation of a serious international terror threat that presented a host of questions for the next president.
We have to look at ISIS as the leading threat of an international terror network. It cannot be contained, it must be defeated. There is no question in my mind that if we summon our resources, both our leadership resources and all of the tools at our disposal, not just military force, which should be used as a last resort, but our diplomacy, our development aid, law enforcement, sharing of intelligence in a much more open and cooperative way, that we can bring people together. But it cannot be an American fight. And I think what the president has consistently said, which I agree with, is that we will support those who take the fight to ISIS.
I would disagree with Secretary Clinton respectfully on this score. This actually is America's fight. It cannot solely be America's fight. America is best when we work in collaboration with our allies. America is best when we are actually standing up to evil in this world. And ISIS, make no mistake about it, is an evil in this world. ISIS has brought down a Russian airliner. ISIS has now attacked a Western democracy in France. And we do have a role in this.
This is a war for the soul of Islam. And those countries who are opposed to Islam, they are going to have to get deeply involved in a way that is not the case today. We should be supportive of that effort. So should the UK, so should France. But those Muslim countries are going to have to lead the effort. They are not doing it now.
CBS News conducted an overnight poll of Democratic and independent voters who watched the debate. 51% said Hillary Clinton won, 28% said Bernie Sanders, and 7% gave the win to Martin O'Malley.
So that's the CBS poll showing Hillary Clinton won the debate. You can tell me what you think down in the comment section as to whether that's an accurate assessment of who actually won the debate. But the next couple clips I want to show are also from CBS's Face the Nation, where Senator Bernie Sanders had an interview this morning. In the first clip, I want to show how John Dickerson asked him to elaborate on something he said in the debate about climate change being responsible for terrorism. And there actually is a good argument for climate change being responsible for refugees and fights over water. And anyway, I'll talk about that a little more after I show how John Dickerson was fairly skeptical of the idea over in this clip.
Bernie Sanders. Senator Sanders, I want to ask you, pick up right where we left off last night. You mentioned that climate change, in fact, is related to terrorism. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, that's not only my observation, John. That is what the CIA and the Department of Defense tells us. And the reason is pretty obvious. If we are going to see an increase in drought and flooding and extreme weather disturbances as a result of climate change, what that means is that peoples all over the world are going to be fighting over limited natural resources. If there is not enough water, if there is not enough land to grow your crops, then you're going to see migrations of people fighting over land that will sustain them. And that will lead to international conflict. So I think when we talk about all of the possible ravages of climate change, which to my mind is just a huge planetary crisis, increased international conflict is one of the issues that we have got to appreciate will happen.
But how does drought connect with attacks by ISIS in the middle of Paris?
Well, what happens, say, in Syria, for example, and there's some thought about this, is that when you have drought, when people can't grow their crops, they're going to migrate into cities. And when people migrate into cities and they don't have jobs, there's going to be a lot more instability, a lot more unemployment, and people will be subject to the types of propaganda that Al-Qaeda and ISIS are using right now. So where you have discontent, where you have instability, that's where problems arise. And certainly, without a doubt, climate change will lead to that.
Now, what Senator Bernie Sanders is saying there, I think, actually is correct. And I think there is evidence that even the Syrian conflict and some of the Middle East problems do come from some of the effects of drought and water shortages and climate change. And I don't have time to go into all the details of that, but I want to show another point where I think, foreign policy is not really Bernie Sanders' strong suit, and that may be why Hillary Clinton is seen as having won the debate by such a wide margin. But this next issue that Bernie Sanders talked about in the debate and talks about in the interview from this morning, I think is where he plays a lot more, or he's a lot more a stronger candidate, is on the issue of Wall Street. And John Dickerson asked him a question that is not very confrontational in this case, I don't think, about how confronting Wall Street is a way for the Democrats to do better in terms of building the party. And Bernie Sanders says, oh, yes, good policy is good politics in this case, in this clip.
To domestic issues, the topic of Wall Street. I want to ask you both about the political idea of Wall Street and then also the substantive debate you had with Hillary Clinton. First, the Democrats have been having a debate about how to build the party, why Democrats are doing poorly at everything but the presidential level. And some Democrats argue that the fight over how to regulate Wall Street, the idea of breaking up the banks, the idea of basically making Wall Street a boogeyman, is important not just substantively, but also to send a message to voters across the country that this is a party that wants to realign the playing field. Do you see that do you see it in that way?
Well, I think in this case, good public policy is good politics. What you have on Wall Street is a handful of banks with incredible economic and political power. These are the people whose greed and recklessness and illegal behavior destroyed the lives or impacted the lives of millions of people, lost their homes, their jobs, and their life savings. Then they got bailed out by the taxpayers, and today 3 out of the 4 largest are bigger than they were before we bailed them out. These are, with 6 large banks, have assets equivalent to 56% of the GDP of the United States of America. To me, it is obvious. And by the way, I should tell you, as somebody who led the effort against deregulation, we have got to break them up so that we don't go through another economic meltdown. And we've got to break them up because they simply have too much economic power. They issue 2/3 of the credit cards and 1/3 of the mortgages in America. So I think reestablishing Glass-Steagall and breaking them up is good public policy, and it is what the American people want to see happen.
So I think it's difficult to disagree with Bernie Sanders' conclusion there that the good policy of being against excessive power on Wall Street is also good politics in the Democratic Party, and maybe in terms of crossover votes. And I think if Bernie Sanders is going to get traction, it's going to be on that issue. But one of the things I think that stands in his way is his the way that a lot of people perceive him as being like a crazy old man or a cranky old man, or I don't know, something like that. That I want to show a brief clip from Saturday Night Live last night, their Weekend Update segment. And this is kind of a low quality clip, which I'll discuss after I show you this last clip in the topic of the Democratic side of the 2016 presidential race. Colin Jost on Weekend Update Saturday Night Live making fun of Bernie Sanders. Over here.
Bernie Sanders has received the endorsement of the American Postal Workers Union, and nothing has ever made more sense than that. I mean, Bernie Sanders looks like if the post office became a person. I don't know, either they're endorsing him or they just issued a new stamp honoring Martin Van Buren.
So, I don't know, that, like I said, I think represents one of the biggest challenges to Senator Bernie Sanders, other than Hillary Clinton's establishment and money connections, is overcoming this sort of stereotype or I don't know, like caricature, I guess is a better word, of him as being a crazy old man or a cranky old guy or whatever it is. I don't know. The cranky part is more with the Larry David impression on Saturday Night Live, which they didn't do this week. But I don't know if you notice how that normally I shrink down my Saturday Night Live clips and put them in the frame of the Saturday Night Live webpage that plays them, and I don't actually record the webpage itself playing the video. I just use it as a background frame to avoid getting a copyright claim. And so I want to talk a little bit about why that one didn't fit and why so many of my clips are lower resolution than usual. I don't know if you can tell, but I can definitely tell. And why I started the show so late, and I've been having a lot of copyright problems. Well, for the last 6 years maybe, I've been recording my shows. Most of my clips come off, I record them on my TiVo from my cable, Comcast cable of all cable systems. That's the one I use. And then coming out of the TiVo, I've been recording them with this ITV, Elgato ITV HD, which unfortunately the input here, the micro USB port, it just got too bent, and the pins got bent over a long period of time for reasons I don't really want to go into. But anyway, I noticed on Friday afternoon that it stopped working, and I went through this whole nightmare. Well, it was also during the Paris attacks. That's why I saved it to this late in the show, because this is such a minor problem compared to what the people in Paris had to go through. I have to catch myself from calling it a nightmare. This frustrating situation where first I ordered an overnight FedEx package that would have solved this problem with a really good piece of equipment that I apparently will be getting on Monday, because my FedEx driver decided not to even attempt to deliver it. I don't know, based on I've read all these articles about how FedEx and UPS drivers have these mechanical metrics that measure how long it takes them to deliver every package, and so if they figure out a way to skip delivering the package, they save time and are rated more efficient. Well, my delivery driver never even attempted to deliver my package, and then I had to go and try to pick it up at FedEx, and it was too late, and it was just very frustrating and stressful. And so I got a much lower quality video capture device to temporarily record the clips for tonight's show, and then I had to overcome this thing called HDCP, which if you use an HDI input, anyway, I don't even want to go into all the details, but I was up a lot of the night getting it all prepared, and that's why the show was late, and I'm kind of tired, and I may be a little disjointed in my delivery, but I wanted to let you know about all that. And I actually had this other copyright fight that I'm not going to even get into, that I hopefully will make a video on later in the week, but I wanted to give you a brief summary of all that before I get to the last two topics, the last four clips for tonight. The first two are from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, where Bill Maher had on his guest, this feminist Muslim, who they commiserated together the way that they're getting criticized by liberals who I think they kind of strawman liberals into not standing up against Sharia law. But I mean, who really is for Sharia law? But anyway, I'll talk about that a little more after you watch that first clip over here.
How could liberals who stood for black people getting to go to college in the 60s, and then when I was in college they were protesting apartheid in South Africa, how can they not stand up against Sharia law, which is the law in so many Muslim countries, which is a law of oppression?
Yeah, I don't understand it either, but what I have figured out is that they run scared. They're afraid of the name calling that you're get targeted with, the name calling that I get targeted with. They don't want to look bad. They don't want to act like they are intolerant of a minority community. But at the end of the day, they are on the side of the progressive Muslims, the people who believe in sexism and bigotry.
They're on the wrong side. It must be even more frustrating for you, because for someone to shout you down, you've lived this life.
Yeah.
You've actually borne the pain. I mean, let's get a little into your story. You were born in India. You lived in Pakistan. You were with a boyfriend there.
Yeah.
You got pregnant out of wedlock, and he left you.
Yeah.
Because, why? Because they always blame the woman.
Yeah, well, the man can go. The woman is left with the evidence of the crime of having had the sex.
The crime.
And a lot of her life story, I mean, I find a lot of her stances commendable, standing up for feminism in the Islamic world, and standing up against the oppression of women in the Islamic world. All of that is really commendable. I did a little research on her, Asra Nomani, and what I find a little strange is that Bill Maher never really discussed with her the things that she has been criticized for by liberals about. I guess she tried to, in her mosque in Virginia, she tried to pray in the male section of, it was a mosque that was split into male and female sections. And that part, I don't have too much of a problem with that. Although it's kind of like, I guess, a Catholic woman, insisting on being a priest or something, where really you should go form your own liberal offshoot and not impose your views on your mosque. Maybe, I don't know that, but like I said, I don't have a lot of problem with her standing up for women going into the men's section, and standing up for women's rights in her mosque. That's whatever. I don't criticize her for, but apparently she's also been in favor of the New York police surveillance of Muslims, and racial profiling of Muslims. I know Islam isn't a race, so it can't be racial profiling, but profiling of Muslims is something that she stood up for, and I think Bill Maher has, and they never even talked about that. They kind of straw man the liberals as being in favor of these terrible practices in Muslim countries, and not what they're really critical of. And here's a second clip from that same interview where, again, Bill Maher commiserated with her about getting attacked by liberals over in this clip.
I don't think any of us who criticize Islam are denying that element is there.
Yeah.
It's just not right now ascendant.
No.
It doesn't seem to be where the energy is.
Yeah.
So when I get accused of demonizing Islam, Nicholas Kristof, who I consider a friend, was on our show. We had a big debate about this last year. I saw him recently, said, Bill Maher demonizes Islam because a small percentage of the faith are extremist. First of all, I'm not demonizing, I'm characterizing.
Right.
How did we get to this place where just describing something is demonizing? And I'm not so sure it's a very small percentage. Maybe it's a small percentage who carry out terrorist acts, but it's not a small percentage, right, who believe in some of the illiberal ideas that support terrorists.
Right, because ultimately, I don't even believe that a woman should get less inheritance than a brother, right? But ultimately, what has happened is that the reporting that I've done is that there is this entire network of bloggers, activists, academics who are from the largest national Muslim organizations like this Council on American Islamic Relations, the highest places in the ivory towers of America, like Georgetown University and UC Berkeley, a favorite of yours, I know.
Where I was invited and disinvited just the way you were invited and disinvited.
Right. And what has happened is that I call them the Honor Brigade, and what they do is they smear somebody like you, somebody like me, for being witness to truth. Because ultimately the truth frightens them. The liberals get on board, and unfortunately, you've had the deniers and the deflectors on board. And then you've had Sam Harris, Majid Nawaz, Ayan Hirsi Ali, Irshad Manji, and now the Honor Brigade comes after me because I'm on with you also.
That's just crazy. I mean, I find it a badge of honor to be disinvited, by the way.
Yes, and that's right.
So I didn't find anything that objectionable in what Bill Maher said in that particular interview, although I thought at the beginning of that clip it was kind of odd the way he talked about how he wasn't demonizing Islam, and then he couldn't say small percentage. He had to like increase it to some larger percentage of Muslims who are supportive of these violent attacks or whatever it was he said. But like I said, it wasn't so much what he said that was objectionable. It's some of the things he left out, I think, especially in terms of what it is liberals are actually criticizing him for. It was a little bit of straw manning, but I want to move on to the last topic. The show's been really long, and I'm kind of running out of time here, but I wanted to show a couple clips on the big controversy at Yale that and there was also another one at University of Missouri that I won't cover quite as much, but I'll talk about briefly after I show a clip of Bill Maher, I think, also leaving important things out when he talks about what happened at Yale. And it all started with like Halloween costumes, which is something Bill Maher had been talking about back around Halloween on his show about political correctness and Halloween costumes. And here's a discussion with Bill Maher and Jay Leno and Dylan Radigan, I think, is in this conversation, and maybe one other person, as I'll discuss after you see that clip here.
About Yale, now we did a funny thing on our show a couple of weeks ago. It was the day before Halloween, about Halloween costumes, and I was saying lighten up. You know, I mean, Halloween costumes, it's a day that you're supposed to be politically correct. You know, there's nothing horrible about dressing up as a mariachi player. Mexicans aren't mariachis. That itself is a fucking costume. Okay, so
I didn't do it, man.
So
You
listen to this.
like
I know. So anyway, so somebody, so at Yale they put out a memorandum saying yes, be sensitive to the costumes. So a Yale lecturer writes an email just saying, can't we, she said, is there no room anymore for a child or a young person to be a little bit obnoxious, a little bit inappropriate or provocative? Basically what I was saying. Well, the backlash against this, her husband had to go. They were screaming at this man to get off the campus. You're disgusting. How do you sleep at night? These are students? This is students. Here's an op-ed in the Yale Herald. He seems to lack the ability, quite frankly, to put aside his opinions. Yeah, maybe he's allowed to have opinions long enough to listen to the very real hurt that the community feels. He doesn't get it. I don't want to debate. I want to talk about my pain. This isn't editorial. Yeah. I have friends who are not going to class, who are not doing their homework, who are losing sleep, who are skipping meals. About an email over a Halloween costume that doesn't even exist?
Yeah, but what happens?
Over an email? Who raised these little monsters?
Well, what happens is, but the pendulum, what happens in any argument, the pendulum is here, and this time it's swung all the way to the other side. And before it swung all the way to this side, you could use the N-word, you could say whatever you want. You could call a government operation wetback, and nobody say anything about it. Okay, there wasn't like a, so now the pendulum has swung back. So now, now the other side gets a taste of what it's like. Well, that's basically what, will it come back to the center? I believe it will.
Okay, but this is crazy.
But that is the opposite of what we see happening.
And that's spreading. That's not just Yale.
And that is a level of intolerance that really does infringe upon free speech and the opportunity to actually communicate, you know, whatever you think. I mean, this is an op-ed.
Yes,
and they're chastising the guy for writing an op-ed.
All of it is fueled by the failure to resolve the structural racism.
Yes.
In other words, that's hypersensitive madness, no question. But the foundation for that hypersensitive madness is the level of incarceration.
Right.
It's the treatment of the cops.
And you know,
I mean, everybody's seeing it, and then we have cameras everywhere now. You can see the cops walk up and they see a black guy and they kill him. But like that cop just walked up and shot
I mean,
that
think
black
of all the things people said about women in the office place. Hey, baby, grab her. Oh, what's she so sensitive about?
Right,
Just grabbed her. Well, now that wouldn't.
Of course.
But I think it's the same thing.
Okay.
Now, there were several interesting things in that clip from the various participants there. What Dylan Radigan said about the structural racism, I think that's actually somewhat important in the Yale example, but also much more important in the University of Missouri example. And Bill Maher had discussed that with his panel before that clip, and I didn't take a clip of that, although one of the things I think Bill Maher did in that previous discussion was he downplayed the structural racism and even the response of the president of the University of Missouri when asked about structural racism, pawning it off on the protesters, saying it was their sensitivity or their perception of a problem and not actually a problem. And having lived in Missouri for 5 years, I know there is a lot of racial tension there and a lot of structural racism in Missouri. And having been a Yale student, I don't know, maybe because of my white privilege or whatever, I didn't experience some of the racial problems that I've been reading about from some of the Yale students. And I don't know, I don't think I can report accurately as to how much of a problem they are or aren't. But one thing I think Bill Maher left out in his discussion there about this lecturer who wrote this op-ed or wrote this letter in favor of free speech. And I am very sympathetic to the free speech arguments. Oh, did someone say something about my collar in the comments? I'm sorry, my collar's all messed up. It's been a really tough day. You didn't have to send me a letter about my collar, but I apologize for having a crooked collar for the whole show. But what I want to tell you is that the person who wrote this letter to the students about being allowed to be a little offensive in favor of free speech wasn't just a lecturer. This was the master and assistant master at, see, now you have me like all paranoid, master and assistant master at Silliman College. And the colleges at Yale University aren't like just places where you go to class. They're residential colleges. It's where you live. So, and the master and the assistant master are a couple who are like set up as like surrogate parents, and they're like the social directors. And so the students are actually arguing with these parental figures who run the dorm they live in. And I think you have to be a little more sensitive about the environment being, welcoming and not insensitive to your experience as a minority when it's the place where you live and where you like go down to breakfast in your pajamas. And so we're really talking about a dorm more than a college. Although, like I said, I am also fairly sympathetic to the free speech arguments of people wanting to, figure out where the line is on being offensive. And I don't think anyone was actually punished for their expression. It was all arguments back and forth, and there are students yelling at the master of Silliman, but I don't think anyone actually was punished for any expression in terms of costumes or their criticism of costumes or any of that. And I want to show one last clip. This is Saturday Night Live again, a more balanced approach to what happened at Yale, I think, that discussed the student perspective as well as the free speech perspective, more so than Bill Maher did, I think, over in this clip.
This week, students at Yale University marched in protest after the dean sent out an email asking students not to wear racially insensitive costumes.
And then a white professor replied all and defended the right to, quote, be offensive.
Okay, first of all, if you're white, maybe just don't go out of your way to jump into a racial debate. Just like in general, when people start talking about race, I'm never like, I'll go first.
But you literally just did that.
Never again.
Look, Professor, if you're going to say something like that, don't hit reply all. All right? Workshop it first. Do what Colin does. Send it to your one black friend with the subject, hey, saw this somewhere. Any thoughts?
Okay, you laugh, but it's helpful. Okay, this is how we learn. Okay, that's why this Halloween I went as White Al Roker.
I thought you were Dr. Phil.
Oh, man, my mom worked really hard on that.
Well, your mom stinks. Look, white kids, if you're not sure whether or not your costume is offensive, just do what black kids do. And don't dress up for Halloween. I mean, you can afford to go to Yale. You can buy your own candy. Trying to win a contest?
Of course, I think it's like 80% of Yale students are on some form of financial aid if you include student loans, but they probably can't afford their own candy. But anyway, that's the last I want to say on that topic, and that's the show's gone on much longer than most of my shows. I wanted to give you a lot of coverage of the Paris attacks and this apparent new phase in what ISIS is going to be doing, or hopefully this is over, but there were some indications, or at least some people who wanted to promote the idea that there will be some additional attacks coming from ISIS. I guess only time will tell, as the pundits say, but what I know about the time is that I have spent a lot of time trying to put this show together with all my problems with the different hardware, and hopefully by next week I'll have all that resolved, and I'll have all the high quality clips that I'm used to providing you. And if you want to help support the program, especially if I'm covering things like terrorism, there's a good chance that it won't even be monetized, which is okay. But if you want to help me through the times when YouTube decides not to monetize my videos, you can click down on the Patreon link in the video description and become one of my patrons. I have about 50 patrons who are pledging, I think, up to $330 a month. I'm hoping to get that up to $400, so that'll be like $100 for each of the 4 shows I do per month. I spend about 10, 12, well, this week I couldn't even tell you how much time it took me. But anyway, also up in this corner you can click on a little eye that you can give a direct donation to my channel if the mood should strike you that you would like to help support what I'm doing here. I hope you enjoyed all these clips I picked out for you and the work I put into presenting them to you, and it left you a little more informed about the Paris attacks and the Republican and Democratic side of the presidential campaign and the other topics I covered. And I'll be back hopefully at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, which is Greenwich Mean Time minus 8 hours at this point in the daylight savings schedule. I'll hopefully have up another video, an edited, produced video this week about my copyright fight against Universal Music Group that was covered by the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So look for that, and look for me next week at 6 p.m. Pacific time, and every Sunday giving you the clips from the corporate media here in the United States. And until then, I will be seeing you all around the internet.